Good evening. Aspects of the slavery trade. And I should like to refer you to the project which was undertaken jointly by the various archives in the region in 2007. This was the Remembering Slavery Archive Mapping Project. And of course, Gateshead Library were a major contributor to that. The archives of the region do contain some fascinating records relating to the role of Newcastle and Gateshead in the slave trade. Now, we tend to think of those cities in the UK who were principally involved as being London, of course, Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow on the west coast. Newcastle and Gateshead, facing the east, were not directly involved in the same way. That does not mean to say they were not involved at all. And so this morning, today, I'm going to firstly start by giving some background to the slavery business. I'm then going to look at the involvement of local families, local names in that business. And then I'm going to look at the strength and growth of the abolitionist movement in the Northeast during the late 18th and early 19th century. Slavery, of course, has an ancient provenance. Homer's warriors, Hector and Achilles, took slaves. That was the war dividend when they sacked cities and captured the entire population of the survivors. Anyone who had a marketable value was movable booty. They were just sold on. It wasn't personal. They were just business. The classical Greeks had slaves. The Romans certainly had slaves. When first Julius Caesar and then Emperor Claudius invaded Britain, they took slaves. Even after the Romans had gone, the Anglo-Saxons had slaves in their households. The Vikings were notorious slavers. They elevated slavery from a cottage industry into a multinational concern. Again, this wasn't personal. Slaves were just a commodity. The Vikings perhaps might in today's terms be called white supremacists. And one of the masterpieces of their slaving enterprise was the capture of the great fortress of Dumbarton, which is the focus, the capital of the old Brythonic kingdom of Strathclyde. Ivar the Boneless, wonderfully named, the conqueror of Northumberland, and his possibly half-brother or cousin Olaf of Dublin, a major slaver, were hired in by the King of Scots, Constantine, to attack Dumbarton. The Scots had attacked Dumbarton, but couldn't make any headway against the vast fortress. But Ivar, the Boneless, Ivar the Cunning, as always, had a cunning plan. He took the fortress, and in one day he and Olaf netted a dividend of 3,000 slaves. King of Scots was perfectly happy. He got Dumbarton and didn't have to pay for it. As late as the 16th, even into the 17th century, Moorish corsairs, Islamic corsairs from North Africa, were cruising off the coasts of the West Country, Cornwall and Devon, and raiding, capturing whole communities and selling them on into slavery. The particular history of slavery and the role which the Northeast played in that history involves what we call the triangular trade, or the North Atlantic trade. This essentially involved the taking of slaves from West and Central Africa to the New World, to the American colonies and the Caribbean, where they were used as slave labor. The need, the market, arose from the demand for such labor. The planting of sugar and tobacco were enormously labor intensive, and the climate, particularly in the Caribbean, was harmful toward Western Europeans. Black Africans made the perfect labor force, especially if they weren't paid. It's called the triangular trade because there were three arms to the trade. Firstly, the slavers, those who were harvesting the slaves, and the European nations which took part were the Portuguese, British, the French, Spanish, Dutch, and Danes. Their fleets left Western Europe for Africa, bearing trade goods. Those trade goods were used to buy slaves. Slaves were not captured, they were not kidnapped by the slavers directly. Too time-consuming, and the climate in West Africa was hostile to Western Europeans. They were bought en masse from local Black African tribal rulers or through Arab middlemen. The European slavers set up trading platforms, entrepôts, on the coast of West Africa Normally, these were fortified positions, and an individual, an official called a factor, would manage the influx and purchase of the slaves, who were then held in the factory, as it was called, until such time as they could be transported. That was the first leg of the journey, first side of the triangle. The second side was to transport the slaves in the most appalling conditions across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they'd be sold on as forced labor. It is estimated that in the 4 centuries of the triangular trade, something just under 13 million black Africans were sold into slavery, of whom something in the region, nobody's keeping count, of 2 million died, thanks to the appalling conditions that they experienced on the slave vessels. Now, slavery was never quite a respectable trade. Those who were involved in it didn't necessarily tend to broadcast it. And normally they would wrap this up in a portfolio of other business interests. Slaving was a business. There was no moral aspect to it. Those who took part in the trade believed that black Africans were racially inferior to white Europeans, and therefore they did not suffer as human beings would suffer, and therefore they could be traded at will, something which strikes us today, and quite rightly, as unimaginably callous and horrific. That was the way that it was. What also fueled the slave trade was what is called the Second 100 Years' War. That's a period of intense military and commercial rivalry between Britain and France, and to an extent Spain, between 1702 and 1815. That period, particularly the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, saw a massive expansion in Britain's overseas interests. France lost her colonies in Canada, lost their colonies in India. The Spanish were relieved of some of their possessions in the Caribbean and also in the Philippines. It's often called the First World War, the 7 Years' War, but it really established Britain as a major world power. The situation in North America very rapidly deteriorated. Relations with the colonists there became so fraught that the Americans, as we now call them, decided to dispose of their imperial heritage and kick the Brits out. That was the war, the American War of Independence, the Revolutionary War. Nonetheless, the Americans themselves were enthusiastic users of slaves. Slavery in America did not end till 1865, at the end of the Civil War, when the Confederate States were defeated and their slaves were freed. And when we talk about freed, that means that, as the abolitionists wanted, black Americans were free, had the same rights under the law as white Americans. That didn't mean they were equal citizens. People like Abraham Lincoln, who we think of rightly as a staunch abolitionist, was not an emancipationist. There weren't many emancipationists. People like Lincoln believed that black men, women should be free, that they should be treated decently according to the law, but that they were not full and equal citizens. Most of the abolitionists did not envisage that black Americans would be given the vote or a role in civic society. That, of course, was the beginning of the civil rights movement, and that, of course, is still going on, as we've seen from recent days. Demonstrations in America, indeed spilling across Europe, show that struggle is certainly perceived to be continuing. Now, as to the involvement of local families, one family I should mention are the Hiltons, as in Hilton Castle in Sunderland. Both William and Anthony Hilton went out to the colonies. William went out as part of the relief force to ease the situation affecting the original Mayflower pilgrims in 1622, 1623. He and others, there are quite a lot of Durham place names in that part of America, therefore there's a suggestion there were quite a number of families who were going out to the Americas. They went to seek opportunity. They went to make fortunes. This was a business opportunity as well as a lifestyle choice. Planting of tobacco and further south in the Caribbean, harvesting of sugar became major industries. Those industries demanded labor, and that labor would be supplied by slaves. The courts in Britain transported men and women to the New World. There were prisoners of war, firstly from the civil wars, the Battle of Dunbar and Worcester, 1650, 1651 Scottish prisoners mainly, who were sent by Cromwell effectively as indentured servants, which was quasi-slavery at that time. The Dunbar prisoners, for instance, have 500,000 descendants living in America. After the Jacobite rebellions in the 1740s, more joined them. Few of these returned. Another means to do so, they made their homes in the New World, and many of them prospered. Military service or naval service were also channels which fed people into the colonies. And of course, many from this area, the region, served in the various wars. The Lord Percy, latterly the Duke of Northumberland, was an enthusiastic advocate of colonial settlement in the period of the American War of Independence. This trade then created vast wealth. And this wealth was largely what fueled the Agrarian Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century in Northern England. Of course, Northern England was a powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution. All of those families who were involved, like the Ogles, the Fenwicks, the Headleys, all of them built their capital using in part returns from investments in plantations in the New World. This was just business, like a bundle of stocks. And all of these families were interrelated. There were marriage arrangements, there were commercial business arrangements. There were large affinities of all of these various names who made vast amounts of money from their work in the New World. Prominent among these were the Trevelyan's of Wallington Hall. They had significant interests in sugar and in tobacco plantations. And of course, they are known as great liberals and philanthropists, and indeed they were. It's very hard to separate the two. We regard slavery, quite rightly, with abhorrence, as we should. At the same time, we continue to reap the benefits or enjoy the benefits of the philanthropic heritage which some of these slavers actually left to our society. And of course, that's an impossible circle to square. A number of names from Newcastle, but perhaps two that spring to mind are the Graham Clarks of Newcastle and the Crowleys of Winlayton. Crowley's involvement was pretty simple. Crowley had massive ironworks, and it was his ironworks that turned out the chains which bound the slaves. The chain, of course, are the very symbol of that oppression, and yet so many of them were made here in Gateshead. And also, the Graham Clarks had at least 5 trading vessels involved in the triangular trade. John Graham Clark also had 2 major sugar refineries in the northeast. The Pinckneys of Bishop Auckland were involved, the Howards, Fenwicks, Ogles, Headleys, Riddells. Most of the well-known names of this region had some kind of interest in the slave trade. And the profits which they built were ploughed into, in some cases, philanthropic ventures in this region. The businesses which they created generated employment and prosperity. It's impossible to separate out in economic terms the slave industry from the rest. Everything was bundled together, just like buying a collective investment scheme, a unit trust these days. And those involved thought no more of it. That's just what it was. Now, I'm going to come on to the other side of this story, which are, of course, the abolitionists. Those are the people who were appalled at the nature and very existence of the slave trade and did their very best to stop it. Though Newcastle had profited from the triangular trade, by the start of the 18th century, there were already those who were beginning to voice opposition to the slave trade. There were deep misgivings, and these misgivings were centered on what we call the dissenting community. These are the non-conformist Protestant religions that included an evangelical strain of Anglicanism, but also Presbyterianism, Baptism, and Methodism. John Wesley, of course, who preached in Newcastle, 1783, was a major opponent of the slave trade. And it was from this source, from these religious communities, that the volume of concern and then opposition began to rise. So in the 18th century, Newcastle and Gateshead were both profiting from this triangular trade. At the same time, the cities were becoming hotbeds of opposition. Now, the nonconformists and Unitarians, of course, also include this. They were very strong in the region, and their strong moral belief was what impelled them to oppose the slave trade. There was also a growing radical tradition in Newcastle. Support for revolutionary movements, support for new ideals, for the new age, the age of reason, was loud in Newcastle and Gateshead. These were progressive, affluent, and for the most part well-educated communities with a thriving middle class, certainly not all of them, but were by any means involved in the slave trade. The escaped, or the freed slave, Lauda Equiano, preached here in 1791. And there was pressure on the Corporation of Newcastle in 1788 to send a petition to Parliament, delivered by John Blackett, opposing the nature of slavery. And throughout the late 18th and early 19th century, this was linked to both the abolition movement and also to the growing reform movement. Earl Grey, who was by the time of the Reform Act Prime Minister, and his son Lord Howard, were leading liberal advocates of the abolition of slavery. Of course, William Wilberforce, who got the bill through Parliament in 1807, which brought the slave trade to an end. Now, this wasn't just a male voice choir of opposition. There were many ladies, particularly from the Quaker community, and the Quakers were very strong in their moral opposition to slavery, who were vociferous in opposing the trade. Even with slavery abolished, or the slave trade abolished, that didn't mean a complete end to slavery within the British Empire. Those slaves which were already owned were still slaves. And full abolition didn't come first until 1833 and then 1838. And of course, this clamour for abolition was going hand in hand with the reform, the movement for reform, parliamentary reform, which of course led to the Great Reform Bill of 1832. And Earl Grey was again a leading member, like William Losh, who were strong advocates for the complete enfranchisement of all those who had been slaves in the British Empire. There was opposition in 1833 to the vast sum of money, £20 million, which was set aside by Parliament to compensate the slave owners. Now, this was contentious, but of course the slave owning lobby still had significant clout. The sugar trade gave the slavers a huge amount of political say, perhaps behind the scenes as much as in front of them. But with the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, attention then tended to focus on slavery in the Americas and in the long build-up to the American Civil War, which began in 1861. 1865, as I mentioned, saw the end of the American Civil War and the legal enfranchisement of unfree Black Americans. This was not, as yet, full equality or civil rights. The sad reality is today that slavery still exists in the world. People traffickers, criminal elements across the Middle East, across Africa, North and Central, North, West and Central Africa, as before, and from Eastern Europe, traffic in humankind. And many of these people are transported under the worst possible conditions. We've seen horrific stories about people freezing to death in refrigerated trucks, things of this nature. And they are effectively slave labor, hopelessly indebted to the traffickers and forced to work off either in menial industries or, in the case of many young women, in sex workers. So slavery hasn't gone. The triangular trade has gone. But not only do the resonances of that trade still continue and persist today, but there is still an active incidence of slavery in our modern world. So our opposition to slavery, our moral repugnance, should not go away. And recent protests, however you view those protests, have shown that people are aware of this and of the awareness to work further together, ideally, toward promoting more full and integrated human rights. That is the legacy of the slave industry. That we have to recognize that this trade was repugnant. It applied to many people, not just black Africans, all the way through history. Just about every class of persons, every nation has either dealt in slaves or been slaves. It's a worldwide institution which affects has affected people of every color and ethnicity. And of course, we have a job, we have a task in front of us to try and ensure that it never happens again. The important thing about history is what we learn. There are many who tend to remember a great deal but learn nothing. The importance of our study of the slave trade today is what we learn from it. We don't just learn the history of why it happened and how it happened and who was involved. We learn why it was such an evil practice and why we must all work as hard as we can to ensure that slavery is finally and irrevocably stamped out from the world. Thank you very much.